And good evening and welcome to our Pause for Thought. This is the last one of the year. We've had quite a few over this year. We hope to carry on next year as well. But I'm delighted that we are gathered to hear this wonderful bit of history of Old Marston during the English Civil War. So I'm just going to look at Joel to check that we are yes. So welcome to those who will be joining us as well later and catching up with this as you find us on the YouTube channel. So let's welcome Colonel Nicolas Lipscombe up to hear our talk.
Brilliant.
Over to you.
Thank you very much, Di. And thank you to all of you for coming out on, well, it's not quite such a filthy evening, but it was certainly a filthy afternoon. We're going to talk about the English Civil War generally to start with, before moving on. I noticed I didn't put the words how it affected what was Marston then. Of course, it wasn't Old Marston and Marston, it was Marston. And the sort of latter half of the presentation will focus in on that. But I want to start with something which my wife Inna brought to my attention when she was preparing for the new school term. It was a thing called the Mass Observation Study. I don't know whether anyone's heard of that. Lots of nodding heads. I hadn't heard of it. It's a really extraordinary study. 1937 it was started in Sussex University. It was basically a social study with a sort of anthropological bent. And in the first swathe of this, a number of areas of society were asked to contribute, and they were considered in the way that they replied to questionnaires. For primary and secondary schools, they were asked a series of questions. And it's curious because it states here about the boys. One can only assume, therefore, the girls were given a different question, which is sort of rather indicative of how things have changed over time. But the boys were asked to write an essay on the greatest person who ever lived. Well, a number of them wrote about soldiers, and statesmen, and politicians, and explorers. That again is a sort of sign of the times, if you like, because I wonder what the young kids would write about today. You know, influencers on social media and the like. Well, some wrote about statesmen and politicians. And it states in the readout from the study that apart from Oliver Cromwell, about whom 8 essays were written, and Adolf Hitler, who inspired 6. Now we have to remember that, of course, this was in 1937, when actually Hitler was seen in a very different light than he was by 43, but certainly by 45. So, Adolf Hitler inspired 6. Very few of the large number of people in this category were the choice of more than one boy, which is curious. And here is what one boy said about Cromwell. About halfway through the Civil War, Cromwell first came into note. The first half of the war had been won by Charles, and unless his run had been stopped, Charles would have won the war, and then England would again be ruled by this tyrant and his ministers. Very, very interesting. That was a young lad, 13 years of age. Now, an interesting point, especially when you juxtapose it or compare it, what another young lad wrote. He wrote about Charles I, and he said, "I think that Charles I is the finest person that ever lived. He was the greatest and gentlest king that ever reigned in the history of this country. He was the best man for being kind and light-hearted when he was living." Which serves to reinforce, if any reinforcement was required, that even in 1937 there was a serious division in the country between those that saw Cromwell as the guiding light vis-a-vis the autocratic king Charles I. Now, the English Civil War, there is no doubt, has no real parallel in English history. There were a number of other tumultuous events. The Norman barons rising up against John, the Wars of the Roses, both the social, political upheaval of the Tudor age as a result of the break with Rome, and post the Civil War, the Glorious Revolution in 1688. But none of them really had the impact on the memory and the conscience of the nation that the English Civil War did. If we look at the English Civil War, it was really all about sovereignty and who was going to govern, whether or not it was going to be the king carrying on in his autocratic manner, or whether or not it was going to be a newly empowered parliament, particularly in the House, the lower house, the House of Commons as we call it. It's curious that this event that took place in the middle of the 17th century was almost exactly 400 years since the first battle for sovereignty, which was, of course, the baronial revolts holding King John's feet to the fire and the signing of the Magna Carta. And then exactly almost 400 years later, there is another battle for sovereignty in this country. And purportedly it was Mark Twain who said that history might not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And it's quite extraordinary that in an 800-year, 400-year cycles that we've had these tumultuous events all about the sovereignty of the nation. Now, as I said, there were three English civil wars, in point of fact. The first of these starts in 1642, which we'll look at in a minute, and finishes in 1646. That's the main one, the one that we are most familiar with. And these started on the back of two religious wars, the Bishops' Wars as they were known, which were really wars fought against the Scots as a result of the Archbishop of Canterbury trying to impose the Anglican prayer book on the Presbyterian Scots, which they were having none of at all. And of course, while we're on the subject of the Scots, of course, the decision that was made yesterday by the Supreme Court is another little facet to the whole business of sovereignty, and in this case within the Union rather than without. But the First War finishes in 46, but it's within 2 years, 1648, that the Second War starts to bubble up in parts of northern Kent on the Medway towns and in Essex, and then also in southern Wales. And that is extinguished the year later, 1649, but it results in the regicide, the beheading of Charles I, the abolition of the House of Lords, and the establishment initially of a republic, but subsequently a commonwealth. And then the Third English Civil War starts about 2 years later, 1650, late 1649, 1650, and finishes by 1651. And that is really mainly about the parliamentarian armies bringing the Irish and the Scottish back under the thumb and into the fold. Now, when you look at where the wars take place, during those three English civil wars, they take place across England and Wales, particularly on the Welsh marshes and briefly into Wales itself. But there's an Irish rebellion or uprising, depending on which side of the fence you sit. There are a series of wars in Scotland. And so to call it the English Civil War is an entire misnomer, a complete misnomer. There have been a number of other names that have been given to the wars, and you can see these on the slide. You know, the British Civil Wars, the Great Rebellion, the Great Civil War, the Puritan Rebellion. That's an interesting name in its own right. But historians have generally speaking now settled on the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. I say generally speaking because when I moved to the village and decided I would write about the Civil War, I'm really a Napoleonic expert, or at least I was at that stage. I would consider myself to have at least a rudimentary knowledge now of Civil War matters. My publisher, when I said, well, I want the atlas and concise history of the Civil Wars to be called the War of the Three Kingdoms, they said no. Because nobody really does know. If I said to people, I wrote a book about the War of the Three Kingdoms, they're really not familiar as to what that is. So it is an atlas and concise history of the English Civil Wars, Wars of the Three Kingdoms. And Wars of the Three Kingdoms is basically what historians generally today accept as, it's not perfect, but it's better than pretty much everything that has gone before. Now, if the name of the war is complex, the causes of the war are really complex. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War itself, it is too raw for most historians to set about writing a history of the battles and campaigns that took place and raged across the three Stuart kingdoms. Some people did it, but of course they tended to be individuals who had fought or who'd had sympathies on one side or the other. Clarendon being a good example, and when Clarendon's work, The History of the Rebellion, was published by his son in the early 18th century, I beg your pardon, the money from the sale of The History of the Rebellion actually funded the construction of the Clarendon building and the establishment of the Oxford University Press, which sat in it for over 100 years. There were parliamentarians, of course, particularly during the period of the Republic and the Commonwealth, who also wrote about the history of the war. But these were very one-sided histories that really didn't give an unbiased and an unprejudiced account of what had taken place. We have to really wait for that till the 19th century. And it's in the 19th century that particularly these two gentlemen, not exclusively only these two, Samuel Gardner and Thomas Macaulay, who were both Whig historians, and they concentrated on writing about the English Civil War very much as a struggle for political and constitutional liberty. This was the period when there was a great deal of movement on parliamentary reform, which had been shelved by the Tory government as a result of the breakout of the French Revolution, the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars that followed. So it is really on hold until that's resolved, and then we move forward. Great deal of social reforms following the Napoleonic Wars, and these two gentlemen wrote very much about the English Civil War in those terms. And that was fine, and that's how the matter lay until pretty much the end of the 19th century, when a series of socio-economic historians, one of which was this gentleman here, Karl Marx, began to look at this very differently indeed. And they began to try and suggest that this was a revolution by the working classes rising up. Of course, this was a logical conclusion to events following on from the American Revolution against the British and the loss of the 13 American colonies, the establishment of the United States, and then the French Revolution that followed immediately after. And of course it was a precursor to the Russian Revolution as well. And that was picked up again and remained pretty much the view of things, that this was a social revolution that had driven the English Civil War for much of the 20th century too, although there was a series of revisionist historians that were looking at this and trying to look at it in a much more balanced manner than had perhaps hitherto been the case with both the Whig and the socio-economic historians. And Karl Marx, as I say, wrote about this in Das Kapital, and it was picked up again in the 1960s when the nation went through some serious changes, particularly in academia, the new left, if you like, which started to grip academia. And Christopher Hill wrote a book, The World Turned Upside Down, which really expanded on Karl Marx's theories and took them one stage further through the Russian Revolution as well. But they were fighting now against a tide of revisionist historians who were looking at more traditional themes, Winston Churchill being one of them. And he wrote in his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, quote, that the underlying apparently clear-cut constitutional issue was a religious and a class conflict. Well, this vision, and I hope that it again rhymes with many of you here, because this vision of David in the guise of the parliamentarian force and armies rising up against Goliath in the form of the autocratic king was absolutely what I was taught at school in the 60s. That it was a class struggle. And that is pretty much how I started my examination and my studies and my analysis of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. And I can say absolutely categorically now, irrespective of what Tristram Hunt has written in a book about 10 years ago on the subject, it is not a class struggle. Father fought against son, and brother fought against brother on the battlefield. When you look at the commanders of the armies, they come from all swathes, on both sides, all swathes of society. This was not a class struggle at all. And indeed, had it have been, it would have been over by Christmas, as they say, because the aristocrats or the nobles, ipso facto the royalists, would have been able to sew it up. They had the knowledge. They'd just been fighting on the continent in the 30 Years' War, particularly bloody conflict in Central Europe. They had also the wherewithal, and they had the finances to be able to establish an army which would have crushed anything that Parliament would have been able to put together. No, there were a number of aristocrats on the side of the parliamentarian forces as well. So, when we look at the causes, and here they are on the slide, and they are shown deliberately as pieces in a jigsaw, because you can't separate them, and they don't evolve individually, they don't evolve chronologically, they evolve together through the run-up to the wars and during the wars themselves. Now, Charles, in the top left-hand corner there, he's the constitutional piece. He's an interesting character, Charles. I mean, one historian wrote of him that he had three character traits. One, that he had no political acumen, and he was also a terrible general, it has to be stated, and as he was the commander of the forces, that didn't help. He was a duplicitous individual, was a liar fundamentally, and he also had some extraordinary ideas. Now, individually, that might have seen him through. He might have got through his tenure, and things may have turned out quite differently. But in fact, put together, they were catastrophic for him in particular, and arguably for the nation. Now, the constitutional reasons, and indeed the socio-economic reasons, we've sort of touched on the socio-economic already. It wasn't a class struggle, but you know, every war has some socio-economic element attached to it, both before and during the conflict itself. And in fact, in many cases, it manifests itself more appositely at the end of a conflict, when there is unemployment and all of the aspects of paying for the war itself. But I want to concentrate on the religious bit, because this in many ways is the most important of the jigsaw pieces. And if I could have made one piece slightly larger, then I suppose that would have been the one, without wishing to distort things. In order to understand how the religious piece fits in, we have to probably go back to the break with Rome under Henry VIII in the 1530s. This was the greatest redistribution of wealth in this country in the history of the nation. Nothing has ever come close to it. It created, as a result of removing the money and the wealth from the church, a new middling class. And that new middling class got a voice. And it wanted to express itself. And it wanted to do this through a political party, or political parties, or through an organ, in this case the House of Commons. And the House of Commons now was growing in stature in comparison to the House of Lords, full of hereditary peers. So the growth of this middling class started to drive, and that's part of the socio-economic piece as well. But at the same time, you have got, really as a result of the collapse of feudalism as well, this change now in direction as to which form of Protestantism the nation is now going to adopt, having rejected Catholicism, or at least Roman Catholicism. And so you end up with a difficult century, it's fair to say. Once Henry VIII dies, Edward VI, brief period, but then Mary, Bloody Mary, of course, who tries to return the country back to Catholicism, and we have a really clear memorial indication of just how how bloody that episode was with Martyrs' Memorial down by St Giles. And then we end up with Elizabeth, who is a much more tolerant queen, a much more tolerant monarch, and who embraced a much broader church, including Roman Catholicism. And this sort of sat fine, but it enabled all of these different Protestant factions to be able to gain more power and traction to put their own position forward. And this dovetails also with the print revolution, which of course was burgeoning by this time, had burgeoned during the wars itself as a result of the collapse of press censorship, and the church and these different factions took full advantage of this. So you've got, and this is just a few, of course the Anglicanism is what the king and his archbishop were purporting, but you've got Presbyterianism, Episcopalianism, Calvinism, Lutheranism, Arminianism, Evangelicalism, Quakerism, Puritanism, which of course was quite a fundamental aspect of the Protestant faith. So you've got all these different, and that's just a small section, all of these different Protestant groups which are vying for their supremacy, if you like, in what is now an open field. And that leads in many ways to many of the frictions that the country found, and indeed that the country found in terms of its dealings with Scotland. Hence, we come back to the Bishops' Wars, which I mentioned at the beginning, where you've got Archbishop Laud, who is trying to push forward the Anglican version, and High Anglicanism, which was very close, far too close in the minds of most Protestants to the Catholic services and the Catholic rites and rituals for their liking. And when he tries to impose the prayer book, the Anglican prayer book on the Scots, of course, that's too much for them, hence the Bishops' Wars. Now, 22nd of August, 1642, the king raises his standard in Nottingham, and really this marks the beginning of the first English Civil War. Events had run out of control. He had left his capital. His wife, Henrietta Maria, and the family had briefly gone over to the Low Countries, and the parliamentarians now had control in London, the key city. I mean, if you wanted to control the country, you needed to have control of London. Now, actually, the standard blew down that night. It was an omen which Charles would have been wise to have noted. But many expected, as they did in 1914, the whole affair to be over by Christmas. Well, that wasn't to be the case, because the parliamentarians were putting together an army themselves, in fact a number of armies across the country, as we'll look at in a minute. The army that was designed to protect the capital and therefore the main effort, the Schwerpunkt, if you like, of London was under the Earl of Essex and his army, which largely used the trained bands or the militia from London, marched out of London to confront the King's army, which at this stage had already gone off towards the Welsh marches to do some serious recruiting. Well, after a bit of manoeuvring around the Cotswolds, the two armies meet on the 23rd of October, just north of here, near Banbury, at Edge Hill. And that's the first major battle of the war. It's an inconclusive battle, there's no doubt about that, and during the course of not the immediate night, but on the night of the 24th, 25th, the two armies separate. But the key thing is that actually the king has, through his manoeuvring, because he got on the London side of Essex's army, before Essex realised that he'd stolen a march on him, he actually now could move to London. He was on the London side, but he chose not to do that, and it was a big mistake. By the time he gets to London, towards the end of the year, we're now in November, remember that battle in October, in fact, the City of London is now protected by the Earl of Essex. There are two engagements, one in Brentford and one at Turnham Green. King fails to defeat or even force the line of parliamentarian forces, and he pulls back. He pulls back now and establishes his capital here in Oxford, and that's how we end up with the Cavalier capital, as it was called, being established here. Now this map shows the situation. It's actually middle of the following year, but to all intents and purposes very little had changed in the winter of 42 to 43, and so the situation that you can see on this map remains pretty much as it was after that failed attempt by the king to move to London. The purple bit is the royalist-held territory, and the orange is the parliamentarian-held territory. And you can see that Oxford here, poking down in this area into here, and you can see this, what I call the Midlands Gap, and you can see that the southwest, Cornwall, is royalist-held, but the rest of the southwest is not. So that's the situation at the beginning, really, of 1643. Now, the winter of that year saw both sides furiously mobilising, trying to capture the foundries that existed, mainly in the ports, and the Navy, the Royal Navy, had gone over to the parliamentarian force. Imagine how that stuck in the king's craw. But the situation was that a number of armies were established, and you can see these on the slide there. So in the centre you've got the Earl of Essex facing off against Charles, based in and around Oxford. In the southwest you've got Hopton, the Earl of Hopton, commanding the royalist forces, facing off against the Earl of Ruthven. And then in the north you've got Lord Fairfax, this is Tom Fairfax's father, facing off against the Earl of Newcastle. And both sides began to build up both material and money, and you've got these three separate sort of areas that are now facing off against each other. The one that sort of sits on its own there in East Anglia, the Earl of Manchester, with the Eastern Association Army, they are sort of waiting there to be tasked. Cromwell is a cavalry commander, a very lowly cavalry commander in that organisation. He had no military skills to speak of, and he starts getting itchy feet towards the end of the 1643 period and starts pushing up over the fens and into Boston and Gainsborough, and has a go at some of the royalist forces there, where he starts to begin to cut his teeth. End of 1643, you can see a significant changes. So the Midlands Gap has become a serious problem for the royalists, because it's now divided the royalist north and the royalist centre, but the southwest has expanded, and so this is now a larger swathe of the country. And this is what that young lad meant when he said, you know, Charles was winning the war. When you look at the map, it does give you the impression that the royalists were on the front foot. And one could argue that they sort of were at this stage, but there were serious issues with the royalist forces nevertheless. Now, the parliamentarians decided at this time that they would reorganise their armies. They liked the way the Eastern Association Army had established itself, and they created the same thing with the North under Fairfax and a Western Association Army under William Waller. Of course, Essex remained as an independent force designed to protect London. Now, although that seemed like a good idea, actually it turned out to be an Achilles heel, and we'll look at that in a second. But both sides realised that they had to change tack in the winter of 1643-44. The parliamentarian force went and negotiated with the Scots to come in on their side and to join forces, while the king sent his representative, the Earl of Ormond, to Ireland. I say he sent, he was probably there actually, because he was his permanent representative there, to wrap up events in Ireland. There had been a rebellion in Ireland, and the idea was that Ormond would settle matters with the Irish clan chiefs, and that would release large numbers of royalist forces from Ireland, but also he opened the invitation to the Irish forces, the Irish Catholic forces, to come over and fight for the king in England. And this was a red line, as you would appreciate, to the parliamentarians. So, 1644 starts, and it starts well, as you would imagine, for the parliamentarians and Scottish forces, who've now combined. The Earl of Leven crossed both at Berwick-on-Tees and at Carlisle with 20,000 men. They descended on to the Royalist stronghold, which the Earl of Newcastle had as his base in York, and we end up with a battle just to the west of York in Marston Moor in the middle of the year. I think it was July that Marston Moor took place. And it was a significant victory for the parliamentarian and Covenanter Scottish force. The Royalists were on the back foot, there's no doubt about it. That could have been the turning event in the war. But it was a victory that was squandered by the parliamentarian forces. And the reason it was squandered was because both the two countries who were commanding the army through a political organ known as the Committee of Both Kingdoms, which had representatives from both Westminster and Edinburgh, was beset with all sorts of argument and difficulty. But more importantly, the parliamentarian armies were absolutely riddled with an internecine struggle that was ongoing at the time. And this was partly the reason why these association armies didn't work. Because a soldier, if he signed up, say, in Cambridge to be part of the Eastern Association Army, was quite happy to fight for East Anglia, but he didn't want to be told to go off to Wales. And likewise, those in the north didn't want to come south, and those in the west didn't want to go east. And so, although it seemed on paper to be a good idea, in that they could execute their own training and recruiting and so on, it didn't work in practice. And by the end of 1644, Essex had basically lost his army. He'd gone into the cul-de-sac of the southwest and lost Withiel after 2 lengthy battles there. The majority of his army had been defeated. Some of it escaped by boats. Remember, the Royal Navy, not the Royal Navy of this period, but the Royal Navy as it was, had escorted on naval transports a lot of that army back up to Southampton and Portsmouth. But it was the Second Battle of Newbury, which was fought in October of 1644, which, where a parliamentarian force of some 25,000 allowed a royalist force of less than half that number to escape. Their execution in terms of the attack, it was a 2-pronged attack which completely misfired, and Cromwell's cavalry charge suspiciously failed to be driven home. And the reason it was suspicious is because the overall commander of those parliamentarian armies was the Earl of Manchester, and the last thing that Cromwell wanted was the Earl of Manchester to chalk up a significant victory against the Royalists. So, it is another year of missed opportunity for the parliamentarians, certainly on the back of Marston Moor. And the net result is that winter there were all sorts of recriminations. There were arguments both from the political side of things in Westminster and with the army commanders of the parliamentarian force. However, out of that series of discussions came a solution, and the solution was to create a new army. The first thing that got passed, it took a lot longer to get through the House of Lords than it did through the House of Commons, was a thing called the Self-Denying Ordinance. And what that was to prevent anyone that held a seat in either the Commons or the Lords from holding a military position. And it was designed exclusively to prevent people like the Earl of Manchester, who Fairfax and Cromwell realised were dreadful commanders, and yet were draining the resources of Parliament and the nation. The idea was that they would no longer be able to hold military positions as well as their position in the Lords. Well, it was quite clear that Manchester was going to choose his position in the Lords over a military position, and a number of others voted the same way. And so it seemed to be that it was moving in the right direction. They agreed to create a new model army. And the new model army was to have 16,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 1,500 dragoons, which is a mobile infantrymen. And they were given guns from what's called the Board of Ordnance. The Board of Ordnance is quite a complex organisation, so I won't bore you too much with that. But the bottom line was supreme command was given to Fairfax, because Fairfax was not a member of Parliament. Cromwell was, and therefore should really, if he wanted to remain active, on active service, have given up his seat in the House of Commons. He had no intention of doing that, and yet he also remained in the background waiting for the right opportunity to take over command of this new model army. 1645 dawns, and the new model army is put to the test much more rapidly than the parliamentarians would have liked. Basically, Fairfax arrived here in Oxford, surrounded Oxford. I say surrounded, he had some troops, mainly on Headington Hill, and they got beaten up, more on that a bit later. But anyway, the bottom line was that the situation was not looking particularly good for the Royalists. They decided to send Prince Rupert off to as a distraction into the Midlands, to draw Fairfax's army away. That succeeded. He beat up Leicester in the process, which was a parliamentarian stronghold, and the net result is that these two armies met in the Northamptonshire village of Naseby, and it's a significant victory for the Royalists and for the parliamentarians. And from that point on, really the Royalists are on the back foot. Now, 1646 was the final year of the war. There was some sweeping up in the southwest. The last battle was actually at Stow-on-the-Wold in the Cotswolds in March. And the rest of the year is taken up with a series of sieges. Oxford, Worcester, and finally Wallingford, south of here, was the final siege of that first civil war. It's often written that there were 3 sieges of Oxford. In fact, the first two in 1644 and 45 were just cordons, if you like, around the city itself. It's the siege in 1646 which was the most important one. And you can see, I think, just about on this slide, this is a map, period map, drawn by Bernard de Gomme, who was the Royalist chief engineer. He came back after the Restoration in 1660, and it's a map of Oxford, and it's an incredibly accurate depiction of Oxford. And you can see here, this is St Giles here, and the Woodstock and Banbury roads coming up along here. The High Street is there. New College up there, Magdalen down here, and you can see the Cherwell River and the Thames/Isis over to the west. Now, this map was drawn in 1644, but he's also drawn this on here, and I'm not quite sure. This looks to me as though it's been added by somebody else at a later date, which is why the authenticity of this map was up for question. But the bottom line is that Fairfax arrived in the city in 1646, soon after that battle at Naseby, and began preparations for a siege. And in the preceding days, a number of Royalist troops had come into the city. But there were a number of Royalist strongholds on the outskirts of Oxford, and you can see those here. We've got Farringdon here, Radcut here, Woodstock had forces, Borstal House, and then Wallingford down to the south. Now, Fairfax was under no illusion that taking Oxford was not going to be easy, and we'll have a look at a map in a moment as to why that was the case. He stated that, quote, that no place to be taken at a running pull, but it was likely rather to prove a business of time, hazard, and of industry. But there is no doubt that Fairfax realised that the war, or the end of the war, was only a matter of time, and so he didn't want to lose lives unnecessarily. So he moved a force onto Headington Hill, into this position here, where he established a sconce or a fort big enough for 3,000 men. And the reason he did that is because when he was there in 1645, the Royalist forces had executed a sortie, which is they come out from the lines, crossing the bridge at Magdalen over the Cherwell, and had attacked the parliamentarian forces there. So he wasn't going to get caught out. He also established another quarter in the north, in Marston, and he also gave orders for the bridge, which had been initially constructed in 1645, to be reconstructed in 1646, while the artillery was moved up the road to Elsfield. And this map gives you a much better feel for the situation in 1646. So you've got Headington Hill here. There's the sconce and the parliamentarian forces. There's Marston. And this is over on the western side of the Cherwell, with the bridge up here, and that's Rainsford's forces up there in what is now modern-day Somertown. Now, in 1605, Corpus Christi College had drawn up a number of maps of Marston, and indeed all the areas where they own property in and around Oxford. And these provide an interesting record of the area in that time. The plotter was a chap called Thomas Langdon. Copies of these maps remain in the college today. Now, it's quite difficult to see exactly where we are here, but this is Elsfield Road here, and this is Oxford Road here. So that's the corner going up to Mill Lane there. But if we move one slide on, you can get a much better feel for this. And here you can see there's Elsfield Road, here, Elsfield Road. There's the church, and we come down, there's a buildings here. There's Unton Croke's house up the top there, or Cromwell House as it's called today. Now, the curious thing about this is, and you can also see Back Lane on there, which is quite interesting, which is a very important aspect, which is not shown on the other one, but it's quite clear on that map there. Now, we know there were many more buildings there in the mid-17th century than are shown on the map. It's believed that Langdon left out a whole load of buildings because they didn't really know who owned them. And as they weren't owned by Corpus Christi, we can only assume that that was behind the decision-making. Now, this came out of one of the books that was published. I think there was a pair of books on the history of Marston. And again, there are some buildings that aren't on here as well, but we can quite clearly see the church, Allen Court, Cromwell House and the Manor House, which is shown because that was a single building. More on that a bit later. And Cross Farm, and down at the bottom here, you've got Court Hill Farm. I think that's just on there, or Court Place Farm, as it was called. Now, the village was to play an important part in the English Civil War, and certainly in the sieges, as we heard that a bridge was constructed, and it was almost certainly at the point where the ferry crossed over the Cherwell River there. And in fact, the bridge had been constructed in 45 as well, again in 46. And the Royalist news sheet, Curious Orlicus, has got a really good description of the bridge. It said in June 46, he took his leave, he being Fairfax. "'Tis fit to tell you what he did there. Sir Thomas came to besiege Oxford. You not believe it, but we assure you 'tis true. His scattered horse appeared near Cowley, passed over Bullington Green to Marston with horse and foot, showing themselves on Headington Hill towards Oxford, and began their siege. They made a breastwork on east side of Cherwell and over the river near Marston, dispatched up a bridge for which General Brown found the wood, and Oliver Cromwell the ironwork. Sir Thomas put over 4 regiments of foot and 13 carriages at their new bridge over the Cherwell. His headquarters was at Marston." That, of course, is what we call Cromwell's house today. Cromwell, however, was at Whiteham, and another time he was at, over near the Trout. Is it Godstead House? I think it was where the old monastery is. And Brown was at Wolvercote. divers rebels. Several rebels were killed on the north and east parts of Oxford. Now, a number of regiments were quartered, and that's what the bridge would have looked like, with the front, the bow, facing up towards the north and the direction of the flow of the river. Now, a number of regiments were quartered in and around the village itself. Sir Thomas Fairfax established himself, not for the first time. In fact, he had been at Unton Croke's house for all three of the sieges. Now, Unton Croke is an interesting character. He was a lawyer. He was a member of Parliament for Wallingford, albeit only for 1 year. He supported Parliament from the outset of the war, and that can't have been easy for him. And this, I think, reinforced, because he was the most important resident in Marston at the time, serves to reinforce the fact that this was not a class struggle in the way that it's been portrayed, perhaps by those socio-economic historians. Now, although Oxford was the Royalist capital, there were many in the town who didn't support the Royalist cause. Now, he went in the 1650s, after the Commonwealth has been established, with another lawyer, Bulstrode Whitlock, to Sweden to try and negotiate an Anglo-Swedish alliance to counter the Danish-Dutch alliance. This is a really important mission that he was given. I mean, this had national consequences. Britain found itself fighting the Dutch in the 1650s. We have a series of acts, the Navigation Acts, which were very important and play a significant part in the maritime defence of the nation right the way through into the middle of the 18th century. And so the fact that he'd been selected to go is a clear indication of his status and position in the Commonwealth. He was created a sergeant at law by Cromwell in December 54. Now, John Owen, the Dean of Christchurch, recommended him for a judgeship the following year, and he was made a commissioner for trials of persons charged with treason in 1656, for which read those that had supported the Royalist cause. He was Justice of Peace for Marston and retired from public life after the Restoration. He dies at 76 and he's buried here in the church, and I'll come back to that. Now, the large mansion, this was his house, Unton Croke's house, that you can see here. And if you chop off this bit, because this was all destroyed in a fire in, I think it was the 1830s, certainly in that sort of period in the 19th century. But if you look at this part of the house, and then you look at the house today, you can quite clearly see that it was that part of the house which is retained, whilst what is called the manor house is, of course, the bit that was completely rebuilt. And it's an important house, called Cromwell House, as we know, but of course, actually, Cromwell never stayed there. But he was there frequently for the 3 to nearly 4 week period that the negotiations took place with the Royalists, and it is where the Royalist surrender was signed then on the 24th of June. Now, it's clear from correspondence that Fairfax sent to his father, who by this stage, Lord Fairfax, was living in Bath, that in fact he knew that things were coming to a conclusion. He wrote and said, "Our treaty doth still continue. We think Monday will conclude all the rest. I think they do really desire to conclude with us." Well, discontent within the city, both from the political commanders, and remember, this was the king's capital, so he had an executive and a judiciary there. Indeed, there was a treasury there, a mint, where coins were struck as well. So there were a number of individuals with the workings of government that had to agree that the city should be given up, because this was really seen as, once that Oxford had gone, that was the end of the struggle. And it was when a letter, and both the political and the military commanders could not agree on matters, which is why the surrender took so long to negotiate. But it was when a letter had been intercepted, written by the king, who'd gone over to the Scots in Southwell, near Newark, during the siege of Newark, that he actually had written in that letter to the governor here, Glenham that he was to make reasonable terms and stop the effusion of blood of our subjects. And on the 20th of June, the agreement was signed, and on the 24th of June, at 10 a.m., the city was handed over. Now, inside the city, there were 3 princes. Okay, James is one. Duke of York was there. Charles II, Prince of Wales, had in fact gone off to follow his mother, Queen Henrietta Maria, to France. The other 2 princes were Rupert and Maurice, who were, of course, the nephews of Charles I. Well, they were all given sort of free passage. The Duke of York was taken back to London, where he joined other elements of his family, and the 2 princes were given passes. They weren't allowed to go to London, and they weren't allowed to leave the country for 6 months. But the garrison marched out, and it marched 15 miles from the city, where it laid down its arms and then dispersed. But most significantly, the Great Seal and other symbols and trappings of authority were handed over to Fairfax. And it was a hugely significant event because, of course, the King's capital had fallen. Now, returning to Marston, the church was to play a pivotal role during the sieges itself, particularly over that period in May to June 1646. And the parliamentarians used the church tower as an observation post to observe the royalist artillery in university parks. And during one of Cromwell's visits in June, Cromwell came in and sat in one of these very pews with Tom Fairfax and other senior parliamentarian commanders and listened to a sermon delivered by this man, William Dell, who'd been nominated as the chaplain of the new model army. And it took place on the 7th of June, 1646, and lasted a full 2 hours. And now, Dell had been an undergraduate at Cambridge. He hadn't actually completed his graduation, but he was, again, very much against the monarchy, very much against tithes, and his views dovetail very much with an organisation called the Levellers, who were a really radical organisation. He was also a fierce critic of the Church of England. And I have a snippet of his 2-hour sermon here to read out to you, which concentrates curiously on attacking the colleges. I find it quite... He said, "Again, if any shall be offended that I speak thus freely against the universities, which are such honourable esteem everywhere in the nation, especially with the ignorant and vulgar people, and with men of all sorts, who have not the right knowledge of Christ and his gospel, wherein are so contained all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, that no part of this treasury, if left out thereof, to enrich heathenism, philosophy withal, which by the gospel is left as a desolate thing, empty and destitute of all true wisdom and knowledge. I say, if any think that I have too deeply censured the universities, let them know that I have done this in the matter as John Wycliffe, John Huss, and Martin Luther. And if you're looking for the real authors of Protestant Reformation, you could argue that Luther was the father, Huss was the grandfather, and Wycliffe was the great-grandfather of that Reformation movement. And several others, goes on Dell, holy men of God and happy instruments in the hand of Christ have all done the same before me. As, for instance, Wycliffe terms the universities Cain's castles, the synagogues of Satan, and affirms that they were never ordained or instituted by Christ. John Huss calls them the lieutenants of the Antichrist. And Luther, in his book Contra Ambrosium Catharinium, showing out of Daniel the prophet that Antichrist is the king of faces or appearances. And he affirms that the universities are one of these faces of the Antichrist, and that they are very comely or sightly to look upon, and yet indeed are very chaos, and indeed an open gate of hell, and that in these the most choice youth of Christian people are prostituted and cast into the open throat of hell, and that in these Aristotle is read, good Lord, whereby the wits of Christian youth are possessed and bullied with human and heathenish learning, yea, are quite blinded and oppressed within. You imagine sitting through that and he delivered that in that very pulpit there. Now, it's somewhat ironic that after the regicide, Dell took up a post as master at Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge. And after the Restoration, he went into hiding, not surprisingly, and lost most of his possessions. Now, Old Marston played more than a cameo role, therefore, in the first and subsequent civil wars. Having seemingly supported the parliamentarian cause during the war, there is, interestingly, no record of recriminations by the parliamentarians on the inhabitants, including Unton Croke, and the inhabitants of Marston itself. Unton Croke dies in 1670, so he probably had 10 quite difficult years, and he's buried along with his wife and daughter here in the chancel. And on his stone, that you can see on the slide here, it says, "Sir, whoever you are, surely you will not grudge me this paltry piece of land in which my body is buried." There's a small piece from St. Luke, chapter 6, says, "Woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you." And it's interesting that the Gentleman magazine in 1800 says of Croke that the inscription on his grave seems to confess of his want of popularity. And that is the story of Unton Croke from Marston, who actually drove and rode a very difficult path in those very, very difficult years for the nation. Thank you.